Alright, we are ready to work on our watercolor sampler today. So for this project, what I want you to have is you should have 3 sheets of paper in your packets that I gave you. So there's 1 large sheet and 2 smaller sheets. Grab one of the smaller sheets for these. So these should be 7.5 inches wide by about 11 inches tall, and we're going to need it to be that size so that our measurements are correct when we break this into squares. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure our paper is right side up. Watercolor paper has 2 surfaces. It's got a front and a back. So the front is a lot more organic looking, and it kind of looks a little bit like tree bark. So this paper, especially, it's a cold press Strathmore 400 series paper, has that really obvious texture. On the back it looks a lot different. It almost looks like little cups. So make sure you have that front side up. So I'm going to set this down, and you're going to want to make sure you have something rigid and absorbent to tape it to. So I'm using just a piece of board here or cardboard. You can also use, if you have a pad of paper at home, the back of that, as long as it's rigid and it won't warp and it's smooth on the surface so you don't get any texture coming through what you're working on. So I'm going to tape this down. Oh, actually first I'm going to measure out. So I want to measure 4 rows and 3 columns with a 1-inch header on here so I can label it. So I'm going to start out, and I'm using a T-square. If you're just using a regular ruler, you'll want to make 1 mark here, 1 mark here at 1 inch from the top, and then connect them this way. If you have a T-square like this, makes it a little bit easier because you can just measure from the top. So I'm going to measure from here 2.5 inches down, then 5 inches. So these are all 2.5 inches tall, each row. And then there we go. So I'll measure, or I will put my lines across this way. And I want to do these fairly light. They don't have to be super dark. You don't have to do these in marker or anything. These are just so that you can keep each area relatively uniform in size. So I have my 4 rows plus my header, and now I'm going to make marks 2.5 inches from the left hand side, and then 5 inches, so another 2.5 inches, so that I can make my columns. So I'm going to have 3 columns and 4 rows, and I'm going to just do these columns not all the way to the top, but right underneath that header. So we have, all of these are going to be different kinds of techniques that we're going to do, and we will label them. So the next step before labeling them is actually to tape this down. And when we work in watercolor paper, we want to tape down our paper when we're working on it so that it doesn't get all warped and watercolor doesn't pool in certain areas. So I'm using this Intertape Polymer Group drafting tape. It releases from the edges, but it holds nice and tight. So I'm going to kind of go all around the edges. And when I do this, I just need a little bit of that edge. I don't need a huge amount of that edge underneath my tape. So I'm going to maybe try to go for 1/4 inch or less. And I'm going to make sure I'm really pushing that down hard on the surface so that it both connects to what it's taped to and connects to the paper. You have to be extra cautious around where the tape is going to overlap, because that's where water tends to get in the easiest. So when I'm doing this, I'll either take my fingernail or I will just take the end of a paintbrush that's smooth, just kind of burnish that down. Make sure I'm pressing nice and hard around the edges to get that tape nice and attached. And I'm going to go all the way around the edges. Again, paying extra attention to those overlap areas and trying not to get it too uneven on that edge. Like, you don't want to attach your tape like this over the edge because it's not going to look nice when we start working on these. Okay, so it's all taped and ready to go. The next thing I'm going to do is just label all of these so we can start working. We're ready now to make our watercolor sampler. So this is an example of one that's already finished with all of the techniques we are going to be trying. And this one has been labeled with all of the techniques and we're ready to go. So you'll want, again, to have a large brush and a small brush. The large brush is really nice to have for laying down large areas of color. You'll want to have your watercolors out, a paper towel, 2 things of water, one for dirty water and one for clean. You might also want to have your tape on hand still for our resists. Crayon, it can be white or any other lighter color. And if you have it, some rubber cement as well. If you don't have it, it's not a big deal. All right, I'm going to start off by trying the wet on dry technique. And that one's pretty simple. I'm going to wet my watercolors quick, and you can do this with just a little drop of water on each of them, but I like to use this little spray bottle filled with water. And this wets my paint so that it's easier to pull out color. With watercolor paint, it's a transparent medium, so the more water you add, the more dispersed the pigments will be and the lighter the color will be. So for example, if I have a blue, and I like to mix my colors on the side here instead of going right out from the watercolor onto the paper, the more water I put in, the lighter the color it's going to be. If I go straight from the pan, that's where I'm going to get the more saturated version of a color. So we're going to create tints and tones by adding more water to our paint. Another nice thing about watercolor is once it dries on your palette, so say this is dry, I can actually take water and reactivate the paint. So I like to call it zombie paint in that sense, because you can let your palette dry but still use the colors you've already mixed on your palette. All right, so wet on dry, I'm actually going to start out with my bigger brush here. And I do that so that I can cover a larger area. If I'm trying to cover a large area with a really tiny brush, it just does not work well. You'll get a lot of variation in your color. So I'm going to mix up a blue-green. Here, put a little water in there. And if you want to add water to things, you can always use something like a water droplet as well to be able to pull over a little bit of water into it, or something like a sponge, which you would get wet and then you could add a few drops onto your palette. It just helps instead of having to scoop water back and forth. You could also use a spray bottle just to spray water directly into your palette. Okay, so I like this nice blue-green color. And for wet on dry, I'm just going to go straight onto the paper. And I'm going to try to get this as even as possible. And if I add too much water to it, it's going to get really pooling in some places. So it might, you know, if I'm having too watery, it's going to look kind of uneven like that and start to have a lot of pooling and shifting of the plates. So you'll get a hang for this. You can always try practicing in your mixed media sketchbook before you go right on here. But with wet right on dry, you're always going to get a little bit of variation. Okay, I'm going to rinse my brush and mix a new color. Wet on dry is good for like mid-size or small areas that you want to have one color that you don't need to be perfectly flat. Okay, my next color, I'm going to do a flat wash. So this, for this, what I'm going to do first is mix my color, and I want to mix my color first so I can move pretty quickly. And I'm going to mix a nice purple for this one. Add a little bit of water. And I'm going to rinse my brush out before starting this one. So I'm rinsing out here. And for this one, I actually want to lay down a very flat area of clear water first. So I'm going to take most of the water out of my brush. I don't want it to be sopping wet, but I'm going to use my large brush to kind of cover this square. It doesn't have to be perfect square or anything. You don't have to go right up to the edges. Actually, you don't want to go up to the edges because you might risk bleeding the paint from one area into another. And I'm just going to look at this from the side angle to make sure that I don't have any big puddles of water anywhere. So I'll try to show you guys that up close here. I don't want it to have any big puddles of water on the side, because then if that happens, when I lay down my color on there, it's just going to pool in that area and make an uneven surface. So I'm checking this from the side, making sure my surface is nice and evenly saturated, but not too wet. You don't want to see like big mountains of water on there that you can shift if you move back and forth. So mine looks pretty good. And then I'm going to take my paint I mixed already, and I'm just going to try to, in one fell swoop, go over that surface. And what's going to happen with this is it's going to flatten out as I go. And because that water is already on the surface, the paint just kind of spreads out on that surface really evenly. Some of the problems you can get into with doing this flat wash technique is if you have too much water down, and I'll show you that. Oops. Let's start over with the actual clean water. One of the problems you can get into is if you have too much water on your surface. So if it's kind of pooling, you can see it right there towards one edge, or looks really thick. When you go to lay your color down, what's going to happen is it's going to be a lot more uneven. Now that might be really nice effect if you're doing something like a sky or something you want to give visual interest, but if you're trying to get it nice and flat like this, this isn't really necessarily what you want to do. Another thing that can happen is if you try to overwork it. So if you try to kind of go back in and kind of fix it over and over again, you're going to end up with streaky washes. So that's not something we want either. Another issue you can have is you can be putting down your color and it can kind of gather in the corners, and to get rid of that you would just touch it with a white or with a wet brush and try to pull that out of that corner. So those are some issues you can run into when you're doing a flat wash. So I'm going to rinse my brush off here again. And the next one we're going to want to do is a faded wash. I'm going to use blue for this one, so I'll pull this out of here, rinse it off, and I'm going to mix kind of 3 different tints of blue and then have the full strength, or 2 different tints. So I'm going to pull a little bit of this blue out, mix it with some water to make like a middle value tint. So I'm going for something like that. And then I'm going to create a really light tint by adding a lot of water to it. And it's nice if you have your sketchbook next to you. You can always just test this out on any kind of mixed media paper instead of onto your watercolor paper, just to see how the color is going to look, because sometimes it looks a lot different here than it does on your palette. So what I want to do with this faded wash is create a nice fade from dark to the white of the paper. So for this, I'm again going to wet the whole surface. trying to get it nice and even. I don't want any of those giant splotches of water on here. Oops, I pulled up a little bit from my... And take your time to do this, because this is going to make a difference in your final ability to get this wash nice and even. You don't want too much water, or otherwise it'll move, and you don't want too little on this either, otherwise the paint won't move at all. It'll kind of stay in stripes. So first is just the color straight out of the dish. I'm going to rinse it so I don't have too much paint loaded in there. Then I'm going to take that second value, and I kind of wiggle my brush as I go, because that kind of tends to pull a little bit of the paint down. One of the mistakes you can do with this is if you have a brush that has too much water in and you go on to the next one, it's going to push that water into the top area and make kind of like a cauliflower effect. And I'm going to take that really light stripe and go there. And as that dries, that will have a nice even fade from dark to the white of the paper. The next thing I'm going to do is actually fairly similar. It's a blended wash, and I want to do a fairly even fade from one color to another color, or a fairly even blend from one color to the next color to the next color. So I'm going to mix out 3 colors here. I'm going to do a nice orange, a red on top, and then a yellow on the bottom. So this will be a nice kind of blend from one color to the next. So I'm going to mix these colors first before I even wet the paper, so I don't have to rush. Rushing is not your friend when you're doing watercolors. It can make things a little bit more difficult. And then some yellow up there. Okay, make sure my brush is nice and clean. And I'm going to get that clear water across the whole surface. So again, I want a water wash underneath this. And what this water wash is going to do is it's going to let that paint disperse across the surface really easily and blend with the other colors. So I'm going to look at this from the side, make sure that water isn't pooled up in the corners or any area, and it's not. So I'm going to start with my red on top, which will kind of turn out like a pinkish red once I put it down. You can see it starts to kind of blend down on its own. I want to work fairly quickly, which is why I have these colors mixed beforehand. I'm going to kind of wiggle those into one another. And you don't want to have your brush too loaded with color or not enough water in it. You kind of want a medium amount of water. And you can always pull a little water out of your brush by squeezing it in your paper towel. And then last but not least, my yellow. So that's a really nice fade from one color to the next color. It creates a nice soft edge. Now again, if you have too much water down, I'll show you what happens. So I've got my paper here and it's got a little bit too much water on it. And when I go to make that nice faded effect, what's going to happen is it's going to spread across that surface a little bit too quickly. Now that can be a good thing if that's what you want to do, but if you don't want to do it, that's what's happening. Alternately, if you don't have enough water in your brush or too much, it can soak up more paint than what you want. So let's say I load too much water in my brush here and I go here, it's going to fade into the next area and spread out. So water's always going to kind of spread out when there's too much of it. And then you're going to get this kind of cauliflower uneven edge, where what we want to do for this one is this. This is actually a technique that you can use if you want to use it. But again, I want you to have this, you know, be able to utilize this when you want to use it, not by accident. Okay, the next technique is wet and wet. And this one's kind of a fun one because this one's a little bit more playful. This one, again, you're going to wet the surface. And this one you can put a little bit more water down than normal. It doesn't really matter if you pool it because we are going to go for some of that fun, experimental, random spreading of water in this one. So when you do have water down and you want something to look a little bit uneven or to blend into other areas if you don't need it to be perfect, this is a really fun technique to use, and kids really like using this technique too. The thing you have to be careful with this is if you do kind of put down colors next to each other, if you accidentally add colors that aren't going to mix well to create another color. So say you want vibrant red and then you put down its complement green next to it. Sometimes it can get a little bit muddy and make some grays that you maybe don't intend to be there. So make sure you're thinking about how the colors are going to mix as you utilize this technique. But that'll continue to spread out and create a nice like soft melding effect. If you add even more water, it can do something like this as well. So this is wet and wet. So you're using wet paint on an already wet surface and letting the water kind of do the mixing for you. Okay, the next one I'm going to do is adding water. And for this one, I'm going to put down, I'm going to do a wet on dry. So I'm going to use some purple here. I'm going to add a little bit of red into it and just a tiny bit of black. For this technique, you want to use a darker value color. For most of these, you want to use a darker value color. So avoid yellow for most of these. And that's just so that you can see the effect really well. So I'm going to lay this down. Try to get that fairly even. And with this one, what I'm going to do is once it starts to sink into the surface just a little bit, I'm going to add water droplets to it. And what that's going to do is disperse the pigment just in a really soft way. So this is nice if you were doing like a sky with clouds or just wanted some variation to your surface. You don't want to let your paper dry too much, otherwise the water is not going to really have an effect. So I'm just going to drop little droplets. You can use your brush to do this as well, or your fingertip even. So I'm going to let that dry on there, but you can already see it starting to have an effect on the surface. And that'll change and shift as it starts to dry. So that's a really fun technique to utilize too. The next few we are going to do, I'm going to kind of pop back and forth between them because they'll need some drying time. So the first thing I'm going to do here is my transparent layers. And for this, I want you to use some lighter colors first, and I'll show you why in a second. So I'm going to put down a really light yellow, so some tints. And you could do any shape for these. I'm just going to use circles. I'm going to add a lot of water to one of these oranges to make a really light tint of orange. And then I'm going to do a really light blue. When you're working with watercolor, you kind of want to work with your lightest colors to your darkest colors. And I'll show you that, why we do that in a second here. If I were to paint over something darker like this with a lighter color, sometimes that lighter color will pick up the darker color, and that can be problematic if you wanted that to show underneath. But if we did our lighter color first, let it dry, and put the darker color over it, it's always going to be there, and that effect won't happen as much. So that's a really important thing to remember about watercolor. You want to go from light to dark if you're working representationally, or if you want that color underneath or on top, the darker value color to show. Okay, so I'm going to let those dry, and I'm going to talk about resists. Now resists are when you want your paper to not be covered by the watercolor. So instead of having to paint around this whole shape, you can lay down a resist. This is tape, this is crayon, and this is rubber cement to keep the white of the paper so that you can paint into that later or have it be white. So for a resist, I'm going to use either a painter's tape or a drafting tape that's meant to be used with watercolor. This is that Intertape Polymer Group drafting tape. And I'm just going to cut out some small pieces of this. You can always put it down. If you need a larger area, put down a few strips on like a cutting board and then cut it out with an X-Acto knife to cover an exact shape. But I'm just going to cut, you know, a little strip and then a shape just to give you an idea of how this works. And when you put this down, you're going to want to make sure that you really push it into the surface, especially if you're overlapping forms. Because if you don't, watercolor can actually sneak, especially right up underneath those forms. So I use my nail to burnish that down, or kind of the back of my brush, and just make sure that that's nice and adhered to the surface. You can also do little shapes. I'm going to do a little heart there. The next resist tool is a crayon. So I'm going to use some crayon. I'm just going to make some marks. And with this, you want to go fairly hard on the surface. Otherwise, it doesn't necessarily show. This is a good technique if you want that white to always be white, or if you're working with younger kids where something like tape or rubber cement isn't exactly feasible. And then I'm going to put a little bit of rubber cement down as well. So I'm just going to put a blotch of it down. You want to lay it down fairly thickly, because if you put it too thin, the paint will actually kind of stick to the surface and create a texture that you might not love. So get that on there nice and thick. These are almost dry. I'm going to move down to this one, lifting paint, just while these ones are bleeding, just while these ones are drying. So we'll come back to these. Now with bleeding, this one's a really fun technique. Basically, you're going to intentionally kind of use wet but between shapes. So I'm going to do a red. And I want these to be nice and watery so that when I kind of move shapes right next to one another, the paint bleeds from one shape to the next. So I'm going to do a red and then a yellow right next to it so that I can see that. I'm not going to connect them until I'm totally done. And then you can see that goes from the area where it's most concentrated to lower concentration. So that's a really fun thing to do. You can use any color, but when you do this, you want it to be nice and watery so that it moves from one area into the other. And then you let the water do the work. So it'll just go right into that shape. So bleeding is a fun technique to use with watercolor. You can kind of help things along a little bit too if they're not totally mixing. You can even kind of move your paper back and forth to mix these a little bit too. Just make sure all of your other areas are dry before you do that. Okay, I'm going to move on to this one next while we're still waiting for these to dry. And what this one is we are going to create a wash of color. It can be a wet on dry or flat wash. I'll leave that up to you. But I'm going to put down a solid color and I'm going to wait for that to dry. And then I'll lift the paint away. So say I was painting something like a sky and then I decided I wanted a tree to go over the top of it, but I forgot to block off an area using a resist. But I still want to be able to paint something lighter or maybe something of the complementary color over the top that you want to lighten the value of the surface. I'll show you how to do that after this is dry. That's still got a ways to go, so I'll move on to dry brush and softening. So dry brush is a really cool and fun technique if you're painting something like grasses or tree branches or anything organic. So I'm going to do this in a blackish brown. What you want to do for this is you want to have your brush relatively dry. And so you're going to pull a little bit of extra water out of it, and then you're going to want to move it over the surface. So you don't want to do something where you're creating a really solid brush stroke. You want to go fairly fast and use the side of the brush so that you pick up that texture of your watercolor paper. So again, take your watercolor here. Use your towel, pull some of it out, and you can even kind of practice on your towel too. And then we're going to create that effect. We're going to use half of this for the dry brush, and then half of it you're going to put down just some normal lines, because we'll come back into that one too. I'm going to make a nice purpley brown here. Just do some normal lines, because we're going to soften those up. Okay, while we're waiting for these ones to dry still, we are going to move into pooling edges. And this one's a fun one, I think, and it requires just a little bit more skill. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a form, and then we're going to kind of make the paint darker around the edges of the form and lighter on the interior. So I'm going to just make a circle here. And I don't want too dry of paint. Or too saturated, because that makes it a little bit hard. Pull the water out of my brush using my paper towel. And then I'm just going to start from the middle. Get it a little bit wet again. And then kind of fade that paint in the central area so it looks like it's pooling towards the edge. Another way you can do this is if you wet your paper first. So I'm going to make a circle out of just the wet water, or the clear water. Water's always wet. And then I'm going to go around the edge first. Pull my water out of my brush, and then just kind of move it back and forth. And I'm really just using the very tip of my brush here to create this effect. I might have to rinse it out a few times. But yeah, you want to work in this while it's wet. So you don't want to do a large area like this because it doesn't quite work well. This works well in smaller areas. Or if you do want to do a larger area, you'll need a bigger brush. Doesn't necessarily have to be a round shape either. Just want to make sure you have your paper towel handy for this because you're going to be wiping your brush a lot into it. Okay, so that's pooling edges. That works really nicely if you want to give a form some variation or some volume. It's also a really effective technique if you're painting representationally. Okay, I think our paint is dry enough, as is our rubber cement. So I'm going to paint over this surface. I'm going to mix a nice darker value I'm going to do and a little bit of a lighter value so you can see how that differs. And you can see how that crayon just doesn't even let that watercolor get to the surface. And then one thing that can sometimes happen if you're using a lot of tape is sometimes the watercolor will just kind of pool right towards the edges of it. So you can always just take the real fine tip of your brush while it's still pretty wet and just pull that paint off. Same thing if the paint kind of sits on top of some of your areas of resist here. You can just kind of suck them up with a fairly dry brush, or if it goes like too dark in between here and you just want to pop some of that a little bit lighter. So let's let this dry while we move into the lifting paint. So this is almost dry. For the sake of time, I will move into that. And what you want to do when you're lifting paint is you want a brush that is clean, and you want most of the water out but a little bit in. And then you're going to want your paper towel nearby so you can blot it. So I'm just going to create an area. I'm going to wiggle my brush back and forth. I'm not going too hard on the surface, because if I do that, what's going to happen is the actual surface of the paint, or the surface of the paper, is going to get damaged. So I can go over that once, maybe twice. You're not going to be able to pull it all the way out. But you are going to be able to get it fairly light. So I'm going to do that in 2 areas. And then I'm actually going to paint over that so you can see why you might want to do something like that. So I'm not moving my paper towel back and forth because that would damage the paper as well. I'm just blotting it down. Now say you wanted to paint some orange over this. If you just painted it over the dark part, you wouldn't really be able to see it. It is the complement of purple, so it wouldn't look very good. It kind of has a brown hue to it. But if you have that same orange over an area that you've lifted the paint from, it's going to turn out a lot more vibrant. So that's why you'd want to use something like lifting before you put down either a lighter value color or one that's a complement. Okay, let's go back to these transparent layers. I'm going to add some of this color I've already mixed over the top. And the nice thing about the transparent layers in watercolor is if you don't work the surface too hard, you can still maintain some of the shapes underneath. So you can see the colors mix and create new colors. So it's another way to mix colors if you're looking to do that. You'll want your colors beneath to be fully dry before you do this. Otherwise, you'll have this bleeding technique happen, or you could accidentally lift some of the paint from underneath. When working with watercolor, again, you always want to work from transparent colors to more or tints to tones to shades, lighter values to darker values. Okay, this isn't quite dry, but I think I can pull this off. Normally you'd want to make sure this is fully dry before you pull this off, but for the sake of time, we're going to do this now. And you can see that I got that tape down there nice and effectively, so it's not going to bleed underneath there. And then my rubber cement, this is going to be harder to get off, but I should be able to use my finger. Again, you would wait till this is fully dry, because otherwise if it's partially dry, I might get some of the watercolor that's partially dry into that white light area. And you can use an eraser to do this if you'd like as well, but you can see the white of the paper is maintained underneath there, which looks great. The last thing, the final touch on this, is softening. So we're going back down to this one here where we've created those lines. And for this one, what I want you to do is almost like we're doing here, lifting paint, but I want you to kind of soften some of these lines up. So say you had something that you wanted to soften later on, you didn't want the lines to be quite as harsh, you can always go back over it and move your paint around. Okay, so that is our watercolor sampler. I hope you've learned a little bit about the techniques we use when utilizing watercolor. Look at how cool the water droplets turned out on here. I think the fade is working really nicely, as is the blended wash, and everything is looking good. So I hope to see your guys's and see how they turn out.